They seem to be talking about sector-by-sector visa caps set on a monthly basis. And that sort of central planning of the labour market just seems to me to be completely bizarre. Overall, especially the recent migrant flows, who tended on the whole to be people who are going to enter the labour market one way or another, are certainly paying in considerably more than they take out. And we don't have that same perceived negative effect of ethnic diversity on social cohesion in this country.
This week, the Conservative Party announced plans to cap visa numbers for immigrants, while the Labour Party is committed to decreasing numbers. But perhaps in the biggest news so far of the campaign, Nigel Farage re-entered the fray to lead Reform Party and has announced plans to, quote, set net zero migration. There appears to be a new political consensus forming that immigration numbers have gone too high and are placing too many burdens on society. However, more liberal voices worry that too much of the blame for society's ills is being put on immigrants, and preventing arrivals could make Britain poorer. Welcome back to the IEA Podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh. I'm the IEA's Director of Public Policy and Communications. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalising policy question. Today's question, should immigration be capped? To discuss, I'm very excited to be joined by the one and only Jonathan Portis. He's a professor at King College London, a former civil servant, as well as an expert in labour markets and immigration. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
As a long-term follower and contributor to the public debate on immigration, I wonder what you make of the in my mind, quite sudden turn to a more restrictive immigration discourse in the last, I would say, maybe year or so.
It's interesting. It's also quite depressing. I mean, I think one of the sort of notable things about the way the immigration policy and debate has evolved over the last 7 or 8 years is since the Brexit referendum, which of course was in large part driven by the immigration issue, although there are very contesting interpretations of precisely how both of what the vote meant and how immigration played into that. But that vote was actually followed by a longer-term trend of actually more positive attitudes among the British public towards immigration, both from an economic and a broader socio-cultural point of view. So public opinion has been going in a somewhat more positive direction. And contrary to and I'll be quite frank that I got this wrong, right? I thought that Brexit would lead to a more restrictive immigration policy overall, on net quite significantly, and significantly lower levels of immigration. And that prediction turned out to be obviously broadly incorrect. In fact, the post-Brexit system that was introduced in 2021 was overall significantly more liberal on net, as it were, less liberal towards Europeans, but more liberal towards non-Europeans. On net, it was less restrictive and led to higher levels of immigration than the previous system. So what you're seeing now is a sort of realization and a backlash against that. And I think partly this is driven simply by where the two main parties perceive the swing voters to be, as opposed to the population as a whole, right? So as I said, the population as a whole has become somewhat more liberal on this, but there's two aspects in which that hasn't necessarily fed through into policies. One is that people who are sort of broadly, relaxed about immigration don't necessarily vote on it. It's probably not their priority one issue, and in fact, the polls show it almost certainly not their priority one issue. They're worried about the economy, about the NHS, living standards, the usual things. Whereas the minority of people who really don't like immigration are much more likely to change their vote on it. And then, of course, there's the fact that those people perhaps are not exclusively, and there's a danger, I think, in talking sort of stereotyping red wall voters or whatever. But it's probably true that those, again, that those people are concentrating on some of the swing voters who voted Conservative in 2019, whom Labour are now trying to get back. So there is a focus on that, and I think that has distorted the political debate to a considerable extent. And
of course, on top of that, you've got the fact the Reform Party threatening the Tories to the right. I think you're right. There was this fascinating kind of post-2016 phenomenon where it seemed like attitudes to immigration got a lot calmer, and that you could kind of find clearer support for immigration. I suppose to some extent, another possible thesis here could be that the arrival of tens of thousands of people in the Channel and that having increased salience in recent years, that sense of like uncontrolled arrivals combined with very high numbers has had perhaps almost kind of some kind of expected backlash against the whole idea of immigration together.
I think there's almost certainly something to that. And I think, whatever you think about what the right policy response is to the arrivals and to the issue and the small boat crossings across the Channel, and obviously I don't particularly support the government's approach, but whatever you think the right policy response is, it's quite reasonable, I think, for the vast majority of the electorate to say this is a bad thing, it shouldn't be happening, something, we don't know what, but something ought to be done about it, and for that to sort of infect the broader, it's not surprising perhaps that infects the broader policy debate on the almost entirely separate question about who we should let in to work here, to study here, or whatever.
Getting back to what has happened in the last few years in terms of these very high numbers, what do you think's really driven that? And as you said earlier, against your expectation for what would happen under the new system?
I think it is to some extent a perfect storm. So you have the pent-up demand that resulted from, of course, travel and immigration being to a large extent shut down over the pandemic. So pent-up demand for immigration combining with pent-up demand in labour markets when the economy reopened and it turned out lots of sectors had big labour shortages. So that's one big factor. The second big factor, of course, was quite large legal refugee flows from Ukraine and Hong Kong. The third factor is the sort of mechanical impact of what happens when you increase international student numbers, particularly after a sharp fall in international student numbers. Obviously, when most students, not all students, but most students don't stay here permanently. So if you increase international student numbers, and they increase from basically zero during the pandemic to a higher number than the pre-pandemic number, that gives you a very large bump in immigration. It will in due course lead to a bump in emigration, and that's beginning to come through already. But in the meantime, that means that pushes net immigration up by quite a lot. And then there was the effect of the new system, which turned out to be overall significantly more liberal towards people coming from outside the EU than the previous system. And on top of that, in turn, a very specific liberalisation that the government introduced to care workers who were not included in the initial post-Brexit system, but the government responded to large staff shortages in that sector, basically lots of Brits leaving, by essentially saying, well, we have salary and skill thresholds for most sectors, but in this particular sector, we're basically going to let as many people come in as can be hired. And when you put that together with poor pay and conditions of that sector leading to an increasing exodus of the people who are already working there, that was a recipe for very, very large numbers.
And do you think there is any legitimacy to the claim that it is just too much? Even if you generally are wanting a liberal approach to immigration, maybe the brake was taken off too much and it accelerated too quickly in such a short period of time?
I mean, I'm not sure I really do buy that. I think it's very dangerous for anyone, especially for anyone who, like you and me, and it takes a sort of broadly liberal approach to get focused on numbers as opposed to getting the system correct. So I think the overnight total liberalization of social care visas in the social care sector with very little control and very little control over the sorts of employers who were operating in that sector and agencies who were operating in the sector, combined with no attempt to address the very real long-running pay and work, that was definitely a mistake. That doesn't mean I think that the overall numbers are sort of a big deal, because they are coming down and they will come down quite quickly anyway, and getting fixated on the numbers from year to year as opposed to saying we want a sensible system that is managed and operates in broadly in the sort of medium to long-term interests of the economy and society. So I think a system that actually delivered migration levels of 700,000 a year indefinitely would probably be the wrong system, but there's nothing to suggest that is the system we have now.
And so the government's response here, of course, or say the Conservative Party's election promise, is to cap the numbers, particularly of those skilled visas. That sounds like something for us you wouldn't support.
Well, I mean, this really is, and the more you look at the detail, the more bizarre it gets for a government, from a party which supposedly has some at least vestigial attachment to a flexible labour market and to generally a market-oriented approach. They seem to be talking about sector by sector visa caps. Wow. Set on a monthly basis. And that sort of central planning of the labour market just seems to me to be completely bizarre and not something that any and I'm not particularly an ultra-liberal by any means. I'm a sort of fairly and as a labour market economist, I'm a sort of fairly conventional mainstream labour economist. None of us in the labour economics field think that that you can manage the labour market of a mixed economy this way. And why would you? Again, surely what you want is a system that says people with this coming in for this type of job and or this type of qualification skill set and or this type of salary level, and let's set those in a way that we get broadly the people we want that deliver, benefits to both their business and to the country as a whole, and broadly rule out people coming in to do, when we think that won't be the case. So you get the system right. You don't try and say, well, and that means 5,000 a month, because that involves a sort of degree of labour market planning, which Whitehall and Westminster simply aren't very good at.
Well, to what extent do you think we're away from that kind of idealised system? Because in a sense, it seems like the points-based system was meant to select immigrants who would provide, either because they were filling a specific skill shortage or because they would be highly educated and have a particular income potential, that you would be selecting, the best and the greatest to come to the UK. Now, perhaps then the issue is other immigrant categories, so maybe dependents with students, or you could probably make an argument about short-term skill visas. Do you need them? Are they cheaper? To what extent do you think we're there or not there?
I mean, I think that given the political economy of immigration policy, both here and elsewhere, the original, it's called the points-based system, but it's not really not. It's much more a skills and salary threshold system, was a reasonably good stab at it, actually. Better than most countries and reasonably up there with countries that we think do these things reasonably well, like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and so on. Certainly better than either the United States with a very inflexible quota-based system which nobody likes, or most European Union countries with typically with all sorts of bureaucratic barriers and hurdles. So I think it wasn't a bad stab. I mean, I think there's still a bit too much micromanaging, particularly when it comes to saying, well, this flower arranger should be on the shortage occupation list, but ballet dancers shouldn't, or vice versa. I don't think that sort of thing is still part of the system, and ideally it wouldn't be. But actually, most people who qualify for skilled worker visas do come in not through those shortage occupations, but simply because they're qualified to a certain level, or the job requires qualification to a certain level, and they're paid a certain amount. And that system does not seem to me to be a bad approximation of a sensible one. It certainly is a long way from perfect, but it's not bad. And my sort of policy advice, to the extent that anyone listens to me or the new is that the broad contours of the system we have are not malfunctioning, and we should broadly stick with them.
So the Labour Party has more or less accepted the Tory analysis that there is too high immigrants. They say the Tories have failed to achieve their goals, which I guess is a legitimate political point to make. Their response is that immigration will go down, although perhaps that's, as you've already said, is to be expected in any scenario because it's at a historical and kind of unique high. But the other part of their plan, which I thought was quite interesting, is this idea, which does seem like almost another form of central planning, that they wanted to link immigration system with new mandatory training and workforce plans for British workers. Now, the premise there seems to be there's a bunch of British workers who aren't getting jobs because immigrants are being pulled in instead.
Well, I agree entirely. That is basically another version of the lump of labour fallacy, which none of us, again, in the labour market field, really believe in. I think there are two the Conservative proposal is just bonkers and dreadful. You could argue that this one is potentially damaging bureaucracy. You could argue that it's really just a fig leaf and it doesn't matter. And I don't think we know yet, to be honest. So it's not quite as bad because it might turn out not to be very, very much in practice. My view on this is pretty simple. Look, there is no doubt the UK has serious problems with skills and training provision. Very deep and long-seated problems, and any government should indeed try and sort those out. Trying to link those problems with the solution to migration policy seems to me to be, at best, won't change anything very much. In the sense that what Labour are talking about, as far as I can see, is another level of bureaucracy above the existing levels of bureaucracy that we already have, which is not what I would do, but perhaps doesn't do too much harm. But my policy was just get on and do something about skills and forget about migration. If it happens that in some sectors or then it does reduce the demand for migration, well, that's fine, no problem. But you don't need the linkage to do that. You should just go and do that skills and training, because that is actually the right thing to do for the country and the labour market anyway, to train people so that they can get higher skilled, better jobs and have better careers. We should be doing that. We're not very good at that. That's fine. Don't really bring migration into the argument.
You could even perhaps bring migration to the argument in almost the inverse way, which is if immigrants either come in at the top and are more productive workers, that should increase productivity overall. But even if, I suppose, immigrants come in at the lower level of the labour market, that should enable the native workers to then move up the chain and do higher skilled jobs. That's
right. I think the evidence indeed does suggest there is some evidence that is indeed what happens. We have evidence from other countries, mostly rather here, that some degree of lower skilled immigration, especially if it's relatively flexible, does indeed promote upskilling and upward occupational mobility. On the other side, high skilled migration, the example I tend to use is from my own sector and personal experience, which is it's difficult to find a sector where you have a higher proportion of migrants than economics in London, right? Both economics in academia and economics in the private sector, economic consultants and so on. Huge proportion of migrants. Do I think that has depressed my job opportunities or salary overall? Well, almost certain. It's almost impossible to prove this with any degree of certainty. But I find it very difficult to believe that actually, by increasing the quality, size, and competitiveness of the sector and its dynamism, my pretty strong prior is that that's been good for my career and good for my salary over time.
So I want to kind of tackle some of the usual arguments that are made against immigration that have come to the fore. Obviously, you've already dealt with one of them about impacts, particularly on wages. One of the other ones you often hear is that a lot of immigrants are providing undue burdens on things like public services, on infrastructure, on housing. It's not very uncommon if you read the comments section in pretty much any article about the housing market, will say, well, the real issue is immigrants. And similarly, you'll hear people say, well, the reason why the NHS is struggling is because of immigrants. I'm wondering what you make of that case.
Well, I would break those out, because I think they're very different. On the NHS and other similar public services, I think it's basically nonsense. Overall, of course, like the rest of us, some migrants contribute more to the public finances than they, quote, take out, and vice versa. And of course, that changes over time. As people get older, they consume more from the public services and so on and so forth. But overall, especially the recent migrant flows, who've tended on the whole to be people who are going to enter the labour market one way or another, are certainly paying in considerably more than they take out. And of course, the biggest single sector that is that migrants are working in, or new migrants are working in, is health and social care. So they're, the situation in the NHS would be, and social care in particular, would be much worse without immigration, both on the staffing side and the financing side. So I'm quite happy sort of dismissing those arguments as being essentially looking at immigrants solely as a burden rather than a contributor, and it's just wrong.
Is it worth, though, I don't know, is there more nuanced arguments to make about different kinds of immigrants or different periods in time? Is does the data change? And there's no evidence post-2008 that maybe the contribution isn't as positive as it once was?
I think probably the evidence suggests it's more positive. And I also think that, from a policy point of view, the issue here is that to the extent that you can distinguish by groups, the groups of migrants who are most likely to be a drain, at least to cost money in the short term, are the ones that we can control, that either we can control less or that we should, for broader moral and political social reasons, control less. So asylum seekers and refugees, for example, are almost certainly going to be a cost in the short term, but that we're not taking them. We don't admit refugees and asylum seekers because we think they're going to be an economic benefit. We think we do it because it's the right thing to do. Similarly, in some cases, when British people marry foreigners and they want to come here, the criterion for whether we should allow people to reunite with their families shouldn't primarily, you may have some economic consideration, but it's not the primary motivation. We do that because as a society, we think you should be able to marry somebody and live with them or bring your kids here. Whereas the categories where we can reduce numbers, like students or some skilled workers, for example, are the ones who are almost certainly going to be a net positive. So when even if on average people are only moderately positive, if you simply go out with the idea of trying to reduce the numbers as quickly as possible, you end up doing economic damage, which is very much what happened under Theresa May. But I do want to come on to what I think is the more
housing, yes,
substantial, because there I think the concerns are much more legitimate. I don't think there's any doubt that in a country where at least in large parts of the country, typically the most dynamic parts of the country, where there are significant restrictions on the supply of housing, you would expect that immigration to push up the price. And I'd be very surprised if that wasn't part of the story here. Now, how large a part of the story is hotly disputed, of course, but that immigration has contributed in some measure to house prices and rents being higher than they otherwise would be. I think it's very, very difficult to, that clearly is the case. And that certainly does seem to me to be something that you have to weigh in the balance. And of course, like the ideal remedy for this is making housing supply more elastic.
You can both be richer in the sense of everyone going to have cheaper housing, irrespective of the number of immigrants. If we just build more housing.
But I do think that when people say, that migration is quote part of the problem here, that's not an unreasonable point to make, and is something that you do need to factor in, particularly when you're trying to. Particularly, I think, at a sort of metropolitan local level, when you're confronted with this problem of, we want high productivity, high density areas to expand. That's part of any sensible growth strategy. That part of that is going to be driven by immigration, almost by definition, given that the population, the other population dynamics are going the other way. But we don't have enough houses there to ensure that the market operates in the way we'd like, that is to provide reasonably affordable housing and a reasonably flexible housing market that people are happy with, which clearly is not the case at the moment.
I mean, to me, it would be summarized as, if you want to fix the housing market, fix the housing market. The just restricting immigration will not do that. There's already a housing crisis. And I suppose even if you took Nigel Farage's word for it and you had net zero migration tomorrow, there would still be a significant housing crisis. And even if you somehow kicked a lot of people out of the country, unless you kicked a lot of, literally millions of people out of the country, you'd still have a housing crisis.
Yes, that's right. But equally, it means that you do have to recognize when people talk to you that they're not making this. Unlike the NHS, say, where I think they've genuinely got it wrong, things would generally be worse without a lower immigration. This is not a point that can one just sort of dismiss as being sort of wrong or prejudiced or whatever. It's not an unreasonable. It's something that those of us on the pro-immigration side do have to recognize as a trade-off. Yeah.
I suppose developing on from the lump of Labour policy, that there's kind of, I suppose, a more nuanced argument that's become quite prominent in the UK in the context of our relatively low productivity and low income growth over the last 15 years, 10 to 15 years, is this idea that immigrants are responsible for a lack of investment in capital, that businesses are choosing to hire labor, which is a substitute for capital. We're not putting enough into things like machinery. People will point to the example of hand car washers in London rather than machine car washers in London, and see the real reason why the UK economy has stagnated is because there's just been such a large number of immigrants.
Well, I mean, I think the car washers example is interesting because it's the only one anyone ever seems to come up with. And, you know, I think it's quite possible that in the car wash sector there is some of that. But the fact that, the car wash sector is not a large part of the UK economy, and the fact that the people who make this argument haven't really been able to sustain it with any either compelling examples or empirical evidence in other parts of the economy seems to me to militate against that. And if you look at, and I think the sort of contrary argument is to say, well, where are the success stories of the UK economy? So the one sort of obvious success story, particularly since Brexit, has been that our tradable services sector, right? High productivity, tradable services, not just, and even mostly not financial services, which hasn't suffered as much as some people had feared because of Brexit, but hasn't done that well. But sectors like management, consultancy, accountancy, advertising, higher education, and so on. These are high productivity service sectors that have done extremely well, bucking the trend over the last 8 years. And those are sectors typically which both a significant concentration of migrants and where there's a lot of churn, often of people moving back and forth in and out of the UK. And there, I think what you see is a correlation between openness to migration, medium and high skilled migration in particular, and higher levels of productivity. So I think, and that sector, of course, is probably 1,000, taken together, 1,000 or 10,000 times as large as car washes. So I think overall, the evidence, if anything, goes the other way.
I suppose you could also make a counter argument here that the reason why capital investment isn't high is relatively little to do with immigration, which is to say, if you're a business deciding whether or not to build a factory or invest in some better machinery for your factory, that should, in my mind at least, on average, make your workers more productive and make you more profitable if it is worth doing that investment. So it's not necessarily the cost of labour that's the determinative factor.
No, I mean, in principle, a higher labour supply ought to, capital is complementary to labour, so you expect it to push up the incentive to. But as you say, I think there are a lot of factors driving the UK's weakness in both public and private investment, and it's very hard to see immigration as being one of them.
So it's not strictly really an economics question here, but I think the kind of final concern we hear still quite a lot about immigration, and perhaps is driving some of the sentiment, is perhaps something more about cultural concerns. There's classic, I think Putnam had the study that was referenced about impacts on social cohesion of having people from different parts of the world all moving into the one place, concerns about whether or not immigrants have the same kind of liberal democratic value set as might be considered important to Britain. I wonder how you think about those kind of issues that I suppose aren't material but seem to still drive a lot of the concern about immigrants.
Well, I think again the Putnam one is revealing in the way that it's prepared, that people who mention it don't really intend it to be, which is that people still talk about the Putnam, I think it's 2002 or so, study in the US, which wasn't about immigration, it was about ethnic diversity quite specifically, and ethnic diversity in the UK. In the US, of course, is largely driven by whites and African Americans who've both had been there several hundred years. And the fact that since that study, a number of people have looked at the same type of data in the UK and not found the same.
And even I think if something recently, if you look back at Putnam's study, the effect sizes were not very big.
No. So the fact that actually you don't get it on the UK data is, I think, isn't quite revealing. We don't have that same perceived negative effect of ethnic diversity on social cohesion in this country, for the most part. I do think it is quite revealing, and it's sort of interesting actually, and just in this little ecosystem, what people call the Tufton Street think tanks, which we're not
even here on Tufton Street today. We've got it confused if you went to the
It's not a generalization that I personally use, and one of the reasons I have not used it is because I've always seen it. There is a cluster of think tanks in this area. Of a sort of generally right-wing persuasion, but I've always seen a sort of split between those who are sort of conservative politically, but economically on the libertarian end, like the IEA, the Adam Smith Institute, and the Center for Policy Studies, and those others. And it's interesting to note that both the ASI and the CPS seem to have, when it comes to immigration, seem to have jettisoned their liberalism, and they're basically on these, frankly, reactionary cultural grounds, decided they're going to be anti-immigration, and to twist, in my view, their reading of the economics to match their cultural anti-immigrant prejudices, which as I say, I give some credit to this institution here for not being for not doing that. I mean, my view on this is, as you say, this is not economics in here. This is something where we do bring our own personal backgrounds and prejudices, if you like. I'm a Londoner. I've lived here off and on, mostly in the same part of London since I was 5. So I'm 58, so that's more than half a century. The part of London I've live in, which is Islington, has changed in demographic terms or ethnic mixed terms, changed immeasurably. Not immeasurably, but of course we do measure it. I know the statistic has changed massively over that time. It's gone from being largely white with a black minority to being incredibly diverse within the white population, and even more so among other populations as well. That does not mean, in my view, that it hasn't retained both its character, its distinctive character, and its social cohesion. It is it's still both changed from when I grew up, but recognizably the same place that I grew up, and has much of the same culture, even as it's absorbed different cultures. And I personally think that's fantastic. So I'm shaped by that particular by my own particular experiences and preferences. Other people may be different, but I do think that clearly a lot of the claims about the negative impacts of migration on social cohesion have very little evidence base.
Well, Professor Jonathan Portis of KCL, thank you so much for joining the IEA podcast. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I really do appreciate your time. If you are enjoying the IEA podcast, please do subscribe in your chosen podcast provider. And if you'd like to find out more about the IEA, follow our work, support our work, please do become an IEA insider at insider.iea.org.uk.